on today's agenda, we'll be looking at a bit more in depth about using printing inside SYSPRO. I'll be concentrating on 6 tips that I've gathered together, which I think you'll find useful to be able to streamline some of your printing within the business. I'll be focusing purely on what's capable within SYSPRO and within Crystal itself. So just to know, this won't focus on anything like SSRS, which is another alternative way to print reports using SQL Server reporting services or any other third-party tools like Automail. So we'll be concentrating purely on what's capable within SYSPRO itself. So let's see what we've got on the agenda. So I want to first go through connection strings inside SRS, and this is just a simple way to embed connection to your SQL Server without having to set up Windows authentication or worry about reports falling over. I find this quite a useful tool to use, which means your reports are more consistent within the business. You're less likely to get IT support issues when a new user can't access a report. I also want to show you how you can embed QR codes into Crystal reports. So within documents itself, I've seen this used to access instruction manuals, which might be linked on a web server somewhere where they scan the QR code to bring it up, or it can be literally used to just embed the EAN numbers, for instance. Images, I want to show you a very simple way you can embed images from your multimedia folder. And I want to show you a few little tips around calling document print programs with parameters and how you can actually use things like the hyperlinks and exceptions that we explored previously to do that. And I want to show you a few nifty ways around printing factory docs. And finally, an alternative way to print or send emails to your suppliers or customers through the form of HTML. So that is actually going to avoid using Crystal altogether, show you how you can do it alternatively. Okay, first we'll look at connection strings. So at the top there, what I've put on my PowerPoint is a fully loaded connection string that can be copied and pasted into a Crystal report. Before this is useful, you first got to use SQL Server to set up a user ID. In this instance, I've called it SRS, and I've given a very simple password of 123. Once that's available within your Crystal report, at the bottom, you can alternatively use a connection string, and simply copy and pasting that into there that allows me to get access to all the tables or views that you require, providing that SRS user has been given the correct permissions in SQL. That means all your reports can use the same user to connect to SQL without having to worry about, again, like I mentioned before, authentication issues or whatnot, which can cause a problem, especially if you use sub-reports heavily within your documents. So once you've put the connection string in, all you have to do is press finish, don't press next, and then you'll be able to access all your tables. So I'm going to open up a report and show you that in action. So I've started a very basic report here, which is a stock label where I will enter the stock code and warehouse. I think I've demoed this one already. So I'm going to open up this in my designer. So hopefully a lot of you will be familiar with this already. Obviously, we provide a course on this, so you can learn more about Crystal and designing these. So hopefully these are more tips on top of what you already know. You'll notice that I'm linking to a SQL view, which gives me some very basic info, the stock code description, the quantity on hand, and also a custom form field called instruction manual. Against my database field, you'll see I'm using, actually I'm going to go through one slightly different method. I'm going to go onto this. This is the connection it's using, and you'll see in my properties, it's set up to use my connection string there. So what that means is that when I run my report, it'll automatically connect to SQL without going through any other authentication or me having to worry about Windows authentication, for instance. And I can simply run my parameters, press OK, and preview it. Okay, so it's a really simple hint or tip you can use just to make sure your report's a bit more consistent. And then when you do move server, for instance, later on, it's a case of then changing the connection strings within the reports, which might be a bit more of a task, but it's still worthwhile. Okay. So my second tip is around QR codes. Now, if you've got access to the learning channel, there is actually a good video on this already, but I want to bring it into this webinar to show you how you can use it. So what you first got to do, you've got to use the insert within Crystal Report and insert what we call an OLE object. From there, you actually add a paintbrush picture. Ignore why that's the case. All it is doing is bringing the barcode from an external web server into as an image into your Crystal Report. Against the pitch, so you right click the property and get the properties, and against the picture tab, you've got a graphic location, and here you can then link it to an external API. So this is one that the video on the learning channel uses. There's various ones that you can use just by going onto Google and finding an API. You need to use HTTP. It doesn't. If you use HTTPS, it'll come up blank. And from here, you can then inject the data. So you can see it's calling this particular web server. It's passing in the stock code, and then it's bringing me back a size. Okay. So what does that look like? So this is my OLE object. It's got no default graphic, so that's why it's blank. Against the format graphic, I have my particular formula. So here, injecting the instruction manual. So what I've done in SYSPRO, I've actually put a link to, I think, syspro.com in the instruction manual. But for instance, you might put a link to a SharePoint site where it will download a PDF against that stock code. So this could be used again in documents to do that without having to attach, drawings or CFCs into the email itself. You could actually link it using QR codes, which means your customers can scan that. Once that's done, I've also put a conditional suppression on. So this is just a useful thing to note that if the instruction manual is blank, well, it won't show anything essentially, which means it won't take up a load of space on the sheet if I'm going through like a details pane. So once I press OK, I'll run that again, and what we noticed before, you might have noticed already, when I ran it for my A100, QR code is embedded into the document. Okay. So a really useful little API you can use, and it's completely free. You do need to be connected to the internet for that to work. Okay. You'll also notice I've got a barcode here. There are other APIs to do the same sort of thing with barcodes. So if you want code 128 into your document, you can do that. This particular one on my sheet, also I've downloaded is a 3 of 9 font, and also done is set the font to 3 of 9, which then displays a barcode. So you've got two approaches there. You can either download the font. That does mean that each client that runs the report will need the font installing, or if you run the API, it won't matter as long as the client's got connection to the internet. It'll generate the barcode on the API and bring it and embed it into the document. So a really useful little tip. So again, that's all available to learn how to do on the info zone. Okay, images. So this is exactly the same idea as QR code. You embed your paintbrush object, and then against the graphic, you can literally just put the same formula, but rather than into an external API, I'm just pointing it direct to my C drive. So this, alternatively, this could be a share on your server, which will then look for the stock code image that has a BMP prefix, and then it will embed it in. So I'm not going to save that because I wanted to point to my C drive. But then, as you noticed before, when I then previewed it, it then showed me the picture of the bicycle inside my particular document. What also was useful to note, that if you set it to can grow, the image might get too big, but if you set that off, it'll always be the size of the box that it's in, so it should shrink it down for you quite nicely. So exactly the same idea as the QR code, but allow me to put an image. So if you do need images within your documents, whether you're sending it to suppliers, then that is one way you can approach it. And it's all about bringing in what we learned from our past webinars, where we set up our multimedia within SYSPRO to show in either Avanti or Espresso or in SYSPRO itself. I can then link it into my documents, and they're all pointing to the same format files. Okay, so in SYSPRO 7.1, previously you could run document print, but you had to essentially hard code the parameters within the automation design program. In SYSPRO 7.1.6, they introduced the ability to actually pass in dynamic values into programs like document print, or like I think the factory documentation's in there as well. But essentially anything that you can use automation design on, you should be able to use this particular technique as well. So in automation design, what I've set up a dispatch invoice group and a dispatch invoice reprint. So all within those groups, all that is checked is the dispatch invoice option, a reprint if it's the reprint, or not a reprint if it's not, depending on my group here. What that means is either within SYSPRO VBScripts itself, I can run those tasks and then pass in additional values. So within this piece of code here, I'm actually setting the dispatch note selection equal to 2, which is the 2, I think it's 2 down or 3 down on the radio buttons, which should be a single dispatch note. And then I put the from dispatch note equal to 165. And then once that's ran, it'll automatically close the application for me. So let's see why that is useful. So first of all, if I look at my automation design and scroll down, I can look at my group here. So as I mentioned, standard dispatch invoice is set to dispatch invoice, the reprint is off, and I've also set up my fax and email preferences here as well. And then I've hit my save form values. The dispatch reprint is exactly the same as that, apart from the fact that the reprint flag is ticked on. Okay. Now what I've actually done, and this is a useful way to actually use hyperlinks to print documents, I've created an application builder. Okay. And within this application builder, I'm using what we learned on a previous webinar about the app builder linkage, the ability to pass a parameter from a list view, smart link or hyperlink with their own SYSPRO into here. So you can see I'm actually consuming the app builder linkage, and then I'm deciding what I want to do with it. And then further down, I'm running my info 410 or info 41 with my particular parameters. So what does that actually do for me? So if I close out here and I go into dispatch note query, and this could be used in lists in a custom app builder, it could be used in an insight tile. So anywhere where the hyperlink for the dispatch is available, I can use this little trick. So against my dispatch note, I've created a print invoice hyperlink. Okay, so I've done that in my hyperlinks and exceptions that we've learned previously. And it simply it looks like this. I'm passing in a hard-coded value of dispatch inv and the key, okay? And then in my code, I'm splitting that out. So if I go back into dispatch note query and run this, it'll call the program for me, it'll print it and then exit, okay? So straight away within a hyperlink, I've actually been able to call the print program, passing it the correct parameter and print it. So I could use that for anything. I could use that for dispatch notes, order acknowledgements, emails, dispatch invoices, standard invoices, credit notes, anything you can print in document print, you could use this little trick for, okay? So if you do have a list of items in a insight tile, that might be dispatches ready to invoice. So that is anything that's at status 7, you can then use the hyperlink to print it rather than having to go into, like, say, dispatch note maintenance, end dispatch, print, etc. So hopefully what we should see now is my invoice. So I've set up, as you can see there, 1414, that's the invoice that's printed, and I can load that. And you can see that is for the dispatch note that I have just queried. So a useful little trick using both hyperlinks and application builders to pass in parameters and then running the document print programs dynamically. I think that's really a quite neat little solution. Okay, slightly easier. So this is without VB scripts, and this is for factory documents only. You can actually call the factory documentation program, passing it a job number, and then you give them a dialog to then print it. So let's have a little look at what that looks like. So I've set this hyperlink up already. The MRP P46 is just a parameter that's expecting. The key is the job. Then it expects 5 blank spaces if your job numbers are numeric. If they're alpha, then it expects the entire string to be at least 20 long. And then 1 is equal to my document format that I want to print. So you can see up here, I've actually included the explanation slightly. So if I look at job query now, and I select a job, I can see I've actually created my print job card option, which I can select. Again, this will be available on an insight tile on a list view. It then brings up factory document print, but actually passing it the job number. And that gives me a bit more information. And from there, I can then do a print and send. Okay, if my document preview is on, it would show. At the minute it's not, and it's just going to send it straight through to the printer. So there's my new factory documentation, printed straight out and looking not very well, not very good, because my document design's not great. But essentially, a really easy way for you to print factory documentation without having to go through the full program, passing in the job number, copy and pasting the value. You literally do it from a hyperlink. Okay, and last but not least, the alternative way you might choose to email your customers. You typically do this maybe on purchase order or order acknowledgements, and less commonly on invoices, but it is more than possible in invoices. You've just got to more account for the tax values and etc. within the document. So what I have here is, rather than send a PDF to my email address, I've got to send a HTML email, which then looks like what we're seeing here. So I actually nicked this from the forums. So if you're on the forums, if you search for HTML emailing, you should be able to find this particular example. But what I've got an application called Send Purchase Order. That's just a little error that's hard coded in there. If I go to the properties, what this is actually doing, I'm using again exactly the same trick we saw with document print, but passing a number, the purchase order number in this example, querying it on the business object, and then generating a HTML document within the body of the email. And then further down, I've got a function to call the SYSPRO email client. You could alternatively use SMTP to send this and call it through that instead. I'm choosing to use the standard SYSPRO email client, which does mean you can actually alternatively add attachments into this as well. So when it opens up the email, it'll attach both the HTML text and any of the PDF attachments that you might want to include. And then when I want to call this, all I need to do, again, I've set up another hyperlink. And none of this has to be done through hyperlinks. It could be done through alternative ways of customization, through links, through toolbar buttons. I've chosen it as hyperlinks because that allows me to get it accessible throughout the entire SYSPRO and in standard programs. So my purchase order is linked to impdh2, which is my app builder. If I change against that, I'm passing it the key, okay? So really simple hyperlink in this particular example. If I go to purchase order query, select a PO, I then again get and I can then select email supplier, okay? And what you should notice, it will run my Outlook. It's probably sitting in my outbox. My Outlook isn't open within the webinar, but what you should eventually see come through into the email is something like this, okay? So this format is just generated in the VB script. You can make this a lot prettier than what you're seeing here, adding different totals, but it's just an alternative way to send emails rather than relying on Crystal or PDFs, because this might suit your business model more. We do also use data switch to do this type of task. So we've put in the past we put e-signatures on the back of order entry to send into DataSwitch to then email an order acknowledgement. That's the same if you're doing EDI, we might do a similar approach. Or if you're doing it for web orders coming from a web shop, we might then also use DataSwitch to send a very similar formatted email. But this is obviously entirely customizable within the code. But it is a bit more legwork to set up. But once it's running, it's quite a neat little solution. So that is what I wanted to show you today in terms of more advanced stuff you can do with printing and reporting within SYSPRO. I hope it's been worthwhile. And if you have any questions, please ask them now, or please feel free to email me later on. Thank you again for your time.